Good day. Today we are going to explain the concept of educational standards and standardized testing, sanctions, and particularly we're using this as a setup for our mock Congress. So we're going to kind of lead into why we're doing mock Congress, and that is the focus of today's lesson. So our goals are to describe the current state of American education system, to describe how federalism impacts education, to explain the concept of a standard or a benchmark, to explain the difference between a norm-referenced and criterion-referenced test, to explain the concept of a high-stakes test, to describe the school rating system and the methods used to create these ratings, and to explain the concept of a sanction. And again, the idea behind all this is that we're going to prepare for our mock Congress, which is going to be a debate on the current state of American education. First, let's start with the problem. If we're going to say there's a problem in American education that is worthy of Congress investigating, first we've got to look at what that problem is. And the problem is that America is no longer number one in education. We are falling behind in most major measures of education data. So when it comes to the rankings set out by the United Nations Educational Index, the United States at one point in time was number one. We have since fallen to number 12, and so we're nowhere near the top of that ranking chart anymore. So we currently stand 12th. If you think America is the greatest nation in the world, maybe this may change your opinion.
Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Diversity and opportunity.
Lewis?
Freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way.
Well, why is America
not the greatest country in the world, Professor? That's my answer.
You're saying...
Yes. And with a straight face, you're going to tell students that America is so star-spangled awesome that we're the only ones in the world who have freedom? Canada has freedom. Japan has freedom. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Australia, Belgium has freedom. So 207 sovereign states in the world, like 180 of them have freedom.
All right.
And yet you, sorority girl, just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day, there's some things you should know. And one of them is, there is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 170th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined, 25 of whom are allies. Now, none of this is the fault of a 20-year-old college student, but you nonetheless are, without a doubt, a member of the worst generation ever. So when you ask what makes us the greatest country in the world, Yosemite?
Pretty powerful, eh? Makes you think. So let's move on to some more statistics. If you don't believe what you've already heard, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, a major international body, ranks the United States 14th overall when you combine reading, math, and science. Not anywhere near number 1. Other data. When looked at the top 10 education systems for math and science, the United States didn't make the top 10. If we want to look at the Global Education League ranking table, again, the United States, not number 1, not number 2, not even top 10. We fall in 26th. We fall way behind in math, reading, and science. The Global Talent Pool. So this measures not necessarily where we're at now, but where we're trending. Are we trending up or down? And in America is trending down. So this shows us the projected share of 25 to 34-year-olds with a tertiary degree across the OECD and G20 countries. So, well, China's on the upward move, India's on the upward move, Brazil, Indonesia, all upward moving. The United States is falling behind. And so we've got this trend over and over again from issue to issue that America is not moving in the right direction. Even if we want to look at what's happening with American education inside of America, so not even comparing us to anybody else, we have a huge achievement gap in America. Achievement gap means the gap between the highest and the lowest achieving students in the country. And so if we look at this gap is continually growing. Now, usually when we talk about an achievement gap, we talk about it in a couple different terms. We can talk about it as being a racial or ethnic gap, the gap between, say, white Americans and everybody else. And the statistics show that there is a huge gap in both reading and math between African American and white students. You can see in 2012, there was a 29% gap between the achievement rates in reading and a 30% gap between the achievement rates in math for African Americans compared to white students. If we look at other charts, African Americans and Latino students have performed significantly worse in math and science than white students did, and that gap is only growing. It keeps getting larger and larger. Another way we can look at the achievement gap is socioeconomic, that is how much money and how much wealth you have. The normal achievement gaps show that the difference between not low income and low income families is fairly significant. Those classified as not low income generally tend to do better in primary school and high school, and then especially on to college, versus students from lower income households in math and reading scores. If we look at colleges that people go to based on socioeconomic, people in the bottom quartile, so in the bottom part of our country, as far as education level goes, those people without any secondary education generally tend to not go to college. On the other hand, most of the people going to college are some of the richest and wealthiest people in the nation. And so again, we see this gap between the rich and the poor. Now, perhaps you're wondering, why is the federal government involved in this? We know with federalism that generally education is not listed in the Constitution, so it should be reserved. It should be a reserve power, say, for the states. Generally speaking, traditionally, schools have been left to the states, state and local government, in order to control. But because of the elastic clause, because of that stretchy clause that we talked about, the necessary and proper clause, especially for the future of interstate commerce, the federal government has given themselves more control in education in recent years. Over the course of the last 30 years or so, the federal government has significantly increased the role that they play in controlling education. They've decided that American education is such a problem that they need to take a look at it, which is why you, as members of Congress, are going to take a look at education. And again, traditionally, this is still a pretty small percentage of what's going on. The federal government provided roughly only 4% of funding to Michigan schools, while most of the money was coming from state, tuition, and local money. However, 4% still can add up to be billions of dollars by the end of a term of Congress. And so when we start to think about things, it's a small portion, it still can make a huge impact on education. So in order to understand this, first of all, we have to understand what is a standard. A standard, or sometimes what's called a benchmark, is an idea or essential knowledge about a specific subject. So basically, it's just the stuff that you should know about a subject before you finish a course or a grade level. So if we say that by the time you get done with first grade, you should be able to add 2 plus 2, that's a standard. If we say that by the time you graduate fourth grade, you should be able to divide, that is a standard. That is a benchmark. Standards and benchmarks are usually broken down either by a course level or by grade level. So things that you should do at the end of first grade, at the end of second grade, at the end of 10th grade, or things that you should do by the time you finish a biology class or a chemistry class or a literature class. By the time you finish a class, you should be able to do these things. So examples of standards, this is from the Michigan State Social Studies Standards, C3, Structure and Function of the Government in the United States of America, 3.1.1, to analyze the purpose, organization, and function and process of the legislative branch as enumerated in Article 1 of the Constitution. Kind of sounds like something we might be doing right now. To analyze the purpose, organization, and function and process of the executive branch as enumerated in the Constitution. To evaluate major sources of revenue for the national government, including constitutional provisions for taxing its citizens. Again, sounds like stuff that you may have done in your high school classes. Other ways to look at things, maybe stuff from the last unit, to describe the role of parties, interest groups, and medias and individuals in determining and shaping public policy through the investigation of such questions as what role do political parties, interest groups, the media, and individuals play in development of policy. Again, these are all things that you should do by the time you finish a civics course. So how do we measure? How do we tell if people are meeting standards or not? It's important to be able to measure if students have actually learned what they're supposed to learn. And so we can use what is called a standardized test. And a standardized test is any assessment where the score will be exactly the same no matter who grades it. Any test, any assessment where the score will be exactly the same no matter who grades it. So probably the most common type of standardized test that you're used to is a bubble test, a multiple choice test. But this isn't the only kind of standardized test. You could, in theory, have a standardized essay test. In fact, the advanced placement curriculum uses a standardized test. And so no matter who grades your standardized test, no matter who grades your AP exam, if they are using the rubric and if they are following it properly, then they will get the same results. So whenever we talk about answers being standardized, it just means that no matter who grades it, we're going to get the same answer. Again, the easiest way to do this is usually through multiple choice, but you can standardize an essay test. So it's not that you can't, it's just more difficult to do. Now, types of assessment. There are two different types of assessments. There are what are known as objective assessments. Those are the ones that we would consider to be judged the more fairly. They are standardized tests. There's one right answer, there's one wrong answer. Either you got it right or you got it wrong. There's not a whole lot of in between. Subjective grading means that there is some personal bias or feelings placed into it. And so maybe if a teacher feels that you worked really hard on it, or it was your best paper even if it wasn't up to what the standards were, then maybe you should still get a good grade. And so with a subjective test, if we gave your test to 10 different people, they might get 10 different answers. They might get the same answer, but they might grade it in the same way. So kind of a way to look at this is looking at a question. Student number 1 was asked, what was the cause of World War II? And so student number 1 said World War II was caused by Hitler and Germany invading Poland. So a standardized grading scale would tell us that answers marked must be correct if they mention at least one of the following: Germany's invasion of Poland, Japan's invasion of China, or economic issues. Did they do this? Yes. And so teacher number 1 says the answer mentions one of the required items, so it is correct. Teacher number 2 grades the same test and they say, yep, the answer is correct, it met the rubric. Non-standardized grading, or subjective grading, would look something like this, where every teacher puts their own personal impact into it. So teacher number 1 said, I like the answer, it's good enough, so I'll mark it correct. But teacher number 2 said that the answer is correct, but the student should be able to do a little bit better, so I'm only going to give half credit for it. That is non-standardized grading, or what we would call subjective grading. So what we're really aiming for in any kind of measurement is to try to make sure that the measurement is objective, to make sure that there's no personal feelings or bias involved in grading of an essay. Now, there are also a couple different types of tests. There are what are known as criterion reference tests. A criterion reference test says at the beginning of the unit you've got a goal. If the student meets that goal, the student will get credit. What this means is anybody who meets the goal can get credit for the assignment. The other type of test is what is known as a normed reference test. And a normed reference test is where your test scores are compared to everybody else. And so if you had the right answer and somebody else had the right answer, but your answer is better, then a criterion reference test says you still had the right answer. Normed reference tests compare you to everybody else. And so if the highest score was 100% and the lowest score was an 80%, under criterion reference, everybody could probably pass. But under normed reference, a person who got an 80% would actually fail because compared to everybody else, they had the lowest score. Other things we can say about labeling types of tests are what are known as high-stakes tests. A high-stakes test is a test with important consequences for the test taker. So oftentimes this means that if you don't pass the test, you don't move on to the next grade level. That's probably the highest of the high-stakes tests, but that is some type of significant consequence for the test taker. Now, when it comes to test writing and rating schools, we're going to look at a couple organizations. There are a number of companies that are professional test writing companies. They specifically write test questions to try to avoid any bias that could be placed into the questions. And so the American College Testing Company, or ACT as it's probably known, is probably one of the most famous testing companies. They write tests like the ACT, the Plan Test, the Michigan Merit Exam. They're not the only testing company out there, but they're one of them. The NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is actually run by Congress, and you guys are members of Congress, so you are actually responsible for running another group that is responsible for writing standardized tests. All schools under standardized tests get a school rating, and they look to achieve what is known as AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress. And what this is a measure, did the students and the school meet the standards that they needed for a particular year. And generally this has been interpreted in America to mean, did you get better from one year to the next? So if a school went from 39 to 40% in 1 year, it'd be a pretty rough year, it'd be a pretty bad year, but they still got better, so that might be meeting adequate yearly progress. On the other hand, if a school goes from 93 to 90%, they would have failed to meet adequate yearly progress since they didn't improve over time. Now, every state has a different way of rating schools, but I'll just give you one example. The Michigan School Report Card would rate schools based on reading score, math score, science score, social studies score, and then performance indicators. Are they headed in the right direction? Are they doing the things that their students need to succeed? And then finally, they would evaluate, did they get better from one year to the next? Did they meet adequate yearly progress? And you can see in this example, this school, Canton High School in Michigan, did meet adequate yearly progress. They got an overall grade of AB. Now when it comes to funding schools, again, we know that schools are mostly controlled by state and local governments, but over the last few years, we know that the federal government, the national government, is playing an increasing role in education. They're spending more and more money funding education, and so that plays into how schools are funded. So again, if you're asking yourselves, why Congress, why the national government, why are we tackling something that is typically held to the states? It's because there's been this trend towards the elastic clause, to expanding the powers of government. The final concept we're going to look at today is the idea of a sanction. And a sanction is basically just what happens if your school doesn't meet a test score? What happens if your school doesn't meet the required scores? They are consequences for not meeting the scores. And so sanctions could range anything from taking funding away from schools or providing more training for teachers, but most people would agree that if a school isn't meeting the standards, there should be some type of consequence for that school, and that's what's called a sanction. All right, well, this should be a basic overview. This should give us a good start for our mock Congress. We'll talk more later. Have a wonderful day.